So tonight we're going to do views of Fort Collins from about 1870 to 1920. And this is from a postcard from about 1909. It was sent, and it's just views of Fort Collins. A church, two churches, and courthouse, and the sugar factory, and the library. So the old, what is now the museum. In 1869, Elizabeth Stone and Henry Clay Peterson constructed a flour mill. The first flouring mill, some accounts say north of Denver, but that wasn't true because there was one in the Loveland area at a place called Old St. Louis. It was the St. Louis flouring mill. But this was down on the river, basically where Willow and Lincoln intersect, where Ranchway Feed is today. Annie Stone was involved in a lot of different things. At the time she went into the flour mill, the grist mill business, she was already 68 years old. Today, most of us think that's well into retirement age. In those days, 68, 69 years old was considered quite ancient. And she lived to be 94 years old. So this was her partner, Henry Clay Peterson from New York State. Mr. Peterson's house. The next year, in 1870, they started a brick factory, the same partnership, Stone and Peterson. And Mr. Peterson built the first brick house down close to the mill. Earlier he had built a workshop across from the mill. The mill the four-story building you see over to the right was the Harmony Mill that was built later. And this brick house was torn down in 1910 when the railroad came through. So we no longer have the brick house that was the first brick house in Fort Collins. His workshop, as I said, preceded it, and I do have some bricks at home. When they tore down the workshop about 20 years ago, Blair Kiefer gave me a bunch of the bricks out of that. So I have bricks from the Annie Stone and Henry Clay Peterson mill. Judge Howe's, the next year, there were enough people in the area, even though, again, they were living illegally, so to speak, squatting on the land of the former military reservation. And anyway, he went around, raised $1,100, and he built the first schoolhouse. And this was a drawing of the schoolhouse that was on, I actually have the map up on the wall, on an 1881 map. In 1879, the first schoolhouse became the First Catholic Church. And that's why it has a cross on it. It wasn't a parochial school. It was a public school. But anyway, there were enough children that they needed a public school. They had created a school district in the 1860s, which was School District number 5. And that's what Fort Collins was for many, many years until the consolidation of the school districts. And before it became Pooter R1. So it was Fort Collins District number 5. This is the old school building down on Riverside, just literally around the corner from where we are. It's now a private home, and there is a plaque out in front of it that identifies it as the first schoolhouse. But it's been a private residence for many, many years. The people who were coming in at this time were interested in agriculture, and this was an area with very, very fertile soil. The problem was we didn't get adequate rainfall, and so they knew that they would have to raise crops using irrigation. And so starting in the very early 1860s, even before the fort was here, you had the first irrigation ditches. The first one coming out of the Pooter River above LaPorte in 1861, just out of the river, and then it flowed about a half mile and then went back into the river. And they drew water out of that, and that was called the Jaeger Ditch. So that one eventually got water priority number 1. They also made some little ponds to catch water. They also began digging wells, since you don't have to go down very far to put up a windmill and bring water up. So this is the beginnings of our massive irrigation system that we have in this area. In 1872, after the fort was opened up, in the spring of 1872, there was a group led by General Cameron who came here and gathered some of the people who were already living here, like Joseph Mason and others, and they created something called the Larimer County Land Improvement Company. It was a company then to sell land and to develop the town. And this is one of the warranty deeds of the two people at the top, Holland and Davis, having sold land to the town company, as it was called. And down at the bottom, the date is December 17th, 1872. So this is a deed to some of the land that would become the town of Fort Collins. In November of 1872, the town company hired Franklin Avery and told him to make a plat of the town. From the river, it was a rectangle, and that was Avery's original plat. And then less than 2 months later, they acquired more land, and they created then a town, and they had a drawing, and J. Boughton, who had bought into the company and would become the town's first city attorney or town attorney, he put up the first building on College Avenue. And this was a wood frame building. It was a 2-story with a false front, and you can barely make out at the top. His brother also was in the building with him, Clark Boughton, and Clark Boughton started in 1874, started a newspaper called The Standard. And up here it says Standard Office. And then down here I think it said Law Office or something. And this building was where the Opera Galleria is today on College Avenue. The photo here actually was taken just after the turn of the century. It had been moved around onto Mountain Avenue. The building that's on the corner of Mountain and Mason on the northeast corner, that's, I think there's law offices in there today, or there were. They tore this building down when they built that building, just about 1908. So the first building on College Avenue then disappeared. In January of 1873 then, Mr. Avery was again hired. He made a larger plat, and he cut off part of his original plat, which was a rectangle, and created a triangle, and that's what today we call the Old Town Triangle. The town company then turned the town plat, the type of instrument that it was, in mid-January over to the town of Fort Collins. And in February then the town incorporated, and a town board, the county commissioners, which had been around since 1861, since we had been a county, the county commissioners then appointed a town board of trustees, which would be the town officers. This is Mr. Avery in his younger days. I would guess he's probably somewhere, give or take, 40 years old. This is a map showing the town, but he cut off, his original plat went like this. And so when he created the rest of the town, and I think he was very happy to do that because they said, well, you know, lay out or plat a larger town. Now he could use baselines and meridians, north, south, east, west lines. He didn't have to go at an angle as he had done with this plat here because the fort was down in here on the river, and that's what created some of the early streets. And so he laid out a town true with the compass, with a few diagonal streets like Canyon, which was the road out to the Spring Canyons stage station. Jefferson is right here. So, well, I guess Riverside, because then Riverside would be the continuation over here. The first schoolhouse was right over in there. Annie Stone's, Henry Clay Peterson's mill, right here on the river. And then the streets, some of the buildings. This was the main intersection of town, was right here, Jefferson and Linden. And then this is College and Linden. So here's College Avenue, College and Mountain. The county commissioners then appointed that board of trustees, and Benjamin Wedby became the chairman of the board, so he was in essence the first mayor of Fort Collins. And he had a building down on the corner of Jefferson and Linden, and in the late 1870s he moved it from Linden Street up to the corner of College and Mountain, and that was his little white drugstore building. This would be the southeast corner. The Kissick building is over here, and the coffee place would be facing on Mountain. And we think that the first town meetings were held probably upstairs in his store building. We're not sure, but we think so. The fountain in the middle here wasn't put in until many years later, but that was a horse watering trough. And that's the one that's over here on the other side of the park in front of the museum now. And they took that out when they put the trolleys in 1907. In 1873, L.R. Rhodes, who was an attorney in town, built the third brick house in town. So they weren't building a lot of brick homes. First one in 1870 and then the third one in 1873. Down in the 200 block of North College on the west side of the street. And this was to be the home for he and his family. And this is back in the 70s when we put a plaque on it. And then this was about 1980. So we tried to save it, but they said, well, it's just a plain little old house. Why would you want to save it? He said, because that's typical of what the houses would have been in the early town. William Stover, who was one of the founders of the town, has Stover Street named for him. As a younger man, certainly not a young man, he built the first brick business building in town in 1874, and I'm going to call it the northeast corner of Linden and Jefferson. His business, his mercantile business on that corner, there's a Quonset hut there today that's the, well, it was kind of the homeless hangout. Is it the Open Door Mission? I wanted to say that. Not to be confused with the Mission further down. So anyway, it's that corner. And that one was there until 1911 when the railroad came through. And then this is Stover much later in life. He had, his wife had come from Mercer County, Pennsylvania. And there were people who came out here from Mercer County, Pennsylvania in the 1860s and tried to start a town. And dug part of a ditch that today is called the Mercer Ditch. And you have New Mercer Commons and so on over by the Senior Center. And so his wife, Jane, was from Mercer County, Pennsylvania, where some of these early people had come from. This is her gravestone out in Grandview. And this is Jefferson Street in 1874, just a year after the town started. And that's Mr. Stover's building down here, so that would be where Linden comes across. This is Jefferson Street. Mm-hmm. And this hardware building was owned by the Betcher brothers, who had hardware in Fort Collins. They had another one in Greeley. They had another one in Longmont, and of course in Denver, and eventually in Leadville, and then they got into mining and got wealthy, and that's where the Betcher Foundation comes from. And and then next to it was a barber shop, and we don't know what this building is. And then this was the Metropolitan Hotel, and it was managed by, of all people, Auntie Stone, Elizabeth Stone. So she had the mill going and the brickyard, and then she was managing this hotel. So for a lady in her early 70s, she kept very, very active. Wide dirt streets, you can see. In 1879, they started building the two-story brick buildings on the south side of Jefferson Street, and this was the Vanderwark building, and a very architecturally unique because it had these things on the roof, which it took me several years to learn, since I don't do very well with architectural history, but those are called finials. And this was the building several years ago when the buildings on Jefferson Street were really pretty run down. And over the intervening years, they've gone in and they've dressed them up and fixed them up a little. So, and if we ever get the trucks off of Jefferson, and you know that's never going to happen, because how long have we been trying to do that now? How many hundreds of years? These buildings might have a chance of really becoming something. In 1877, the town was dying. In 1873, when the town started, the population was 600 people estimated. In 1874, the newspaper said the population was 400. The first year after the town started, we lost a third of our population. Part of that was people were moving into the mountains because it was the beginning of the silver boom. Then we had, in 1873, 4, and 5, there were plagues of grasshoppers that came through every summer and devoured all the crops. So it was like, yeah, this little agricultural colony is just not going to survive. But in 1877, W.A.H. Loveland down in Golden said he was going to build a competing railroad because Greeley had a railroad. They had John Evans Denver Pacific that connected them with Denver and Cheyenne. So Mr. Loveland said, well, I'm going to build a railroad from Golden to compete, and I want to go through Fort Collins. And he came to the city fathers, and they said, you know what? We need a railroad. You can have a right-of-way down the middle of Mason Street forever.
If they only knew.
Forever. And from there, the town then began to grow. By 1879, there were enough people in town. It was beginning to be a little booming town. They needed a bigger school building. So the citizens voted in School District Number 5 to sell bonds and build a school on Remington Street. And this was a sketch of the school. It appeared on a map, and it had this beautiful decorative tower. It was 2 rooms up and 2 rooms down, and then a janitor's quarter in the basement, and a Boynton furnace in the basement. And that's actually a picture of the school. I don't know, the tower must have fallen down. I don't know, fallen in or something.
Probably never built.
But it did have a bell in it, and eventually they added on to the back, and that building was torn down in the 1960s to build the DMA Plaza. But they called it the Remington Street School, or later just the Remington School. The same year, on the Agricultural College campus, the college was here starting in 1870, 3 years before we were officially a town, but there was only just a little claim shack on the land on the south edge of town. Avery put the college on his map because it was actually designated for Fort Collins by the territorial legislature in 1870. And of course, the Colorado joke is Fort Collins has the Aggies College and Canyon City has the prison. And do you know why? Canyon City had first choice. Nobody wants an Aggies college, right? So anyway, in 1879, then they built the first building on the campus, which eventually became called the Old Main as it aged. This is just shortly after it was built. We do know from what's going on right here that it was after 1883, or because they have a sprinkler, which meant the waterworks, the water system was in. Look at the size of those trees, and this would be the College Avenue side of it. So those are big old trees now. Also in 1879, Mr. Avery had gone back, I can't remember if it was the year before or 2 years before, and married his fiancée, Sarah, who he had met at Cazenovia College in upstate New York, and brought her out here and built a stone cottage for her. And this was their residence. And the original building is just this much over here. So this part over here, this is actually 2 additions, and then a wooden barn out in back. No tower on the building yet. This is a picture of the building in 1890, and this is their son Edgar out in front, and their daughters Meddy and Ethel sitting on the porch. The front parlor is here, but there's no tower and no rear parlor and no rear bedroom yet. And this was the year that Edgar wrote a diary, and he wrote every day of that year. But he also wrote in there about kind of sort of like the Tom Sawyer story about painting, whitewashing the fence, about how he convinced his friends to help. Look, there's some whitewash, and there it isn't painted, so helps us also to date it. And then here's Meddy and Ethel about 10 years later, and you can see the tower is now there. Actually, probably not even 10, probably 5 years later. By then, in the mid-1890s, the tower had been added. And then this is Franklin and Sarah in their later life, portraits of them, and they have a chair very similar to this chair in the entryway of the Avery house. And then this is their gravestone. They both died in the 1920s, so they lived to be fairly old. And then the house was purchased by the city in the early 70s and turned over to the Pooter Lemarks Foundation, who created a house museum in there. And just about 10, 11 years ago, they finally got the fountain working, and now they're having trouble with the fountain. And the city said, well, we'll solve the problem. We'll come in and tear out the fountain. And so far, we've held them off on it. And all we want to do is just get it fixed so it runs again. Here's Jefferson Street in, 1882. This is the Vincent Demmel's Boot and Shoe Maker Shop. And this was the Collins House, which was a stone hotel. And it's interesting because the stone hotel, as they sometimes referred to it in the paper, replaced Auntie Stone's cabin, which was also a hotel. And when I read the Stone Hotel, I thought they were talking about her cabin, but it was that one. And then you have the Bonton Billiard Hall over here, the Tedman House, which was a 3-story hotel, the Old Grout Livery Barn, and then sticking out right here is the balcony on the front of the Old Grout building, which was a building from the fort that was torn down in 1881, and this was built in 1883. So kind of brackets the date. And we have no idea who the people are in the picture, but look at that little boy. He's filthy. I think he's been playing in the street for 2 days in the dirt street. Okay, but Mr. Avery made wide streets when he laid out the town, and according to Ansel Watrous' 1911 history, somebody asked him, why such wide streets? And he said, we were way out west and there was lots of room, so I gave, the people wanted wide streets, so I gave them to them. And I doubt that Avery said that. I think he was more of a practical surveyor, and he made the streets wide enough that a fully loaded freight wagon could turn without having to back up. Now, I presented that as a theory in an article in the Triangle Review in the early 80s, and now it's a fact. So, here's a view of the town about that same period, around 1880, from the mill, looking toward Jefferson Street, over here. And there's the stone hotel that you just saw. Abner Loomis, another early resident, he came out here, he prospected, and then he started a cattle ranch out north of LaPorte, and eventually moved into town and went into the banking business. In 1880, he built this beautiful house on the southwest corner of Magnolia and Remington, where the downtown Safeway is today. And it was a 2.5-story house with a carriage house here, and that's his wife, Melinda Maxwell Loomis. And here's a mounting step for the carriage. Beautiful pair of horses. And then this is what the building looked like back in the 1970s, and it was the Landmark Apartments, and it was in horrible condition. It needed new wiring and a new heating system, and it was all overgrown with trees and bushes. And so some people bought that property and said, it's going to cost us more money to fix it up than it is to tear it down. And so 100 years after it was built, this is where it ended up, a pile of rubble. Up over the windows, you see these nice lintels. I have one of those in my backyard. Put it in my car, and my car kind of went down, almost scraping the bumper. And then this is the Safeway. This is the site today. Loomis and Charles Andrews went into partnership with Charlie Sheldon and William Stover, and they built this building to be the home of the Poudre Valley Bank building. And this is called the Loomis and Andrews block. And this is the old, for many years it was the Linden Hotel. We'll come back to that building in a bit. And then here's Mr. Loomis's grave with his wife Jane out in Grandview. And I love this picture. This is about 1880. And this is the Trimble block right on the corner of Trimble Court, still there on College Avenue. They must have been around the 4th of July. There is a wire holding up that flag. It's just not floating in the air. But here comes this guy down the middle of College Avenue from the north, riding hard and fast. So he's either being pursued by Indians or maybe an irate husband. And that was the year that they began building the Opera House block. Mr. Boughton's building was moved around the corner. And this is as it's almost finished in the spring. You can see the trees are just leafing out. This is looking south toward Mountain Avenue, would be right at the corner here. And they're just about to put the roof on and finish off the building. And then here's the finished building, except we had a fire in 1885 that took this part of the Welch block off, and they saved the bottom 2 floors, but lost the top floor. For many years, in this building here where it says bank, and that the name bank is still there, if you recall. I want that kind of paint for my house. That was the Fort Collins National Bank, and originally that was Mr. Avery's bank. He started a bank called the Larimer County Bank, and it only existed for 8 months, and then he changed it to the First National Bank. And it's still, we still have the First National Bank in Fort Collins. And this was built originally as the Robert Miller Bottling Works. It says manufacturer and bottler of all kinds of soft drinks and bottlers of golden lager beer. And out behind on the railroad, remember the railroad came down Mesa Street, so right behind it was the railroad. That's the beer depot. That's where they brought in the beer, and then he bottled it. And have any of you ever drank golden lager beer? I bet you have. Today it's called Coors. That was Adolphus Coors' first beer that he brewed, was called Golden Lager Beer. And this is the building today, right next to Al's Newsstand, down on the 100 block of North College. And then here's the Tedman House that I showed you earlier, the 3-story hotel down on the corner of Linden and Jefferson. And then here's an earlier picture of it. On the corner of the hotel was the City Drugstore. And this was Frank Stover, William Stover's brother, who came about 5 years after William to settle in Fort Collins, and he was a druggist, and he moved into the Tedman house when it was built, and he's the one standing here. And I would just love sometime just to do a photo essay on him, because it's like he would go around town and find somebody taking a picture and stand in the picture. He is in so many photographs. And here he is as a much older man. After the town went dry in 1896, he was very often cited by the police department for selling alcohol, because a lot of the stuff that you could sell in a drugstore had high alcohol content. So he'd be issued summons for selling intoxicating liquor. So my kind of guy. He started out originally in the old Grout building. In 1882, he tore it down, and he was going to move into it. Here's from an early painting of the town that Frank Miller did, showing Fort Collins in the early 80s. And that's supposed to be Benjamin Wedby in front of it, because Ben Wedby was in there originally. And that's supposed to be Auntie Stone coming. That was the town's first store and post office and everything. This is the photograph that painting was made from. And Frank Miller painted it actually in the 1940s. And he was living in the Linden Hotel at the time, and he gave it to the Linden Hotel, and they said it was to pay his bar bill. Well, that's kind of hard in a dry town to pay a bar bill, right? So we think it was to pay his rent. Here's this would be about 1881, because here's the Opera House is finished, and this is still standing. So he started building a new drugstore in 1882, and in September of 1882, it was burned to the ground. There was a fire, that in the Robertson block next door, and that led then to the people to say, well, we really do need a water system. And he didn't have it fully insured. It took him 5 more years before he could build a new building on that corner. But here they're using the fire hydrant down here to water down the street to keep the dust down. And then this was the building then that he finally finished in 1887 across the street, Stover's Drugstore. Stover's actually City Drugstore. And this was the interior. And you know what that is? Yeah, it's a soda fountain. They have all different flavors down here, and then they have the little fizzy, the things for soda, the seltzer water to make the sodas. Gas lamps. And since it had gas lamps, you see what's up here and here? Bird cages. Those were the first alert system. If those little birds fell over, it meant there was a gas leak. Same thing that the miners took down in the mines with them. They took a little canary in a cage. And if that poor little canary dropped over, they knew the air was getting bad and it was time to get out. Because remember, the early gas didn't have the smell like it does today. And then here again, here's my buddy Mr. Stover standing in front of his store, his drugstore, and then look what he got right in front of it, a fire plug. He was also on the town board of trustees at that time. Also in 1881, they decided to build a fire station, a firehouse on Linden Street, and there's actually what the building looked like. Today, where this building, the old Colpitts building was, and then this is where Tuesday Morning is. Okay, this building was destroyed many, many, many years ago. I think by a fire, which is kind of funny next to the firehouse. So, and then the Silver Grill is here. And years ago, when John Arnolfo was doing work in the first building of the Silver Grill, where the counter is, he actually uncovered part of that sign. And so now we had a waterworks system. The city offices were upstairs, and the fire department was downstairs, and now we could have hoses because we had fire hydrants. So the fastest runners in town became the hose cart team. This is not the way they would normally dress. These are their competing uniforms. They'd compete against other hose cart teams. And when the bell would ring in the fire tower saying there's a fire, they would run down to the fire station, find out where the fire was, grab the hose cart, and they would run as fast as they could to the fire and hook up to a fire hydrant and start spraying the water. The hook and ladder wagon, as it was called, they had to hook the horses up to it. It took a little longer, and then that followed. And then there's the building as it was restored. This addition was made in the 1890s. And the city hall was down there until the 1950s when they moved over to LaPorte and House. And then the fire department was in there until the 70s. And here's the first home of the Poudre Valley Bank, or in those days it was called Stover and Sheldon. This is on the alley in the 200 block of Linden. Was built in 1879, and then in 1905 a second floor was added, and the back was added on. And you can see, if you go down there, you can see the outline of the original building right here. And this today has been all fixed up. Jim Reedhead did a lot of work on it back in the 80s and lived upstairs, and now Lynn and Al Dunton have it as Centennial Gallery, and they now live upstairs, and they've redone the apartment upstairs. And then in late 1882, early 1883, they finished building the Loomis building. This is the cupola on top, and they moved then a half a block up Linden and moved into the building, and it became the Poudre Valley Bank, eventually the Poudre Valley National Bank. And this is from a drawing that was a fine pen and ink drawing that was on their checks. This was off a very early postcard of Fort Collins. I don't know what was burning behind it, but just, you know, a really, really nice building. And then just after the turn of the century, Poudre Valley Bank built this building on the corner of the southwest corner of College and Mountain, where City Drug is about to leave, unfortunately. This was the old Poudre Valley Bank building, or the Linden Hotel, back in the late 70s. No, I'm sorry, early 80s. It was after the Old Town project was completed. And then about 12, 13 years ago, it was restored, and now it's just a gorgeous building. Really, a lot of money went into it, and some really good work. And this is the Reed Doth block that was built. You can see here, Reed was a jeweler, and I love all the things. You know, he was a jeweler, but he sold pianos and organs and domestic sewing machines. So, and I think you could also get your hair fixed. And then Doth was a baker, so there was a bakery in there also. And that's the building here. None of those are Frank Stover. But looking southwest on Linden toward, you can see the foothills back here in the background. And then here's the Poudre Valley Bank, or the Linden Hotel building. And then here's when some of the work was being done down on that. They took off some of the, you remember when the Salvation Army was in there and so on? And then when they restored the Reed Doth building, and then Sahiro's, the Japanese restaurant, went in there. And one of the nice things when this building was restored, and it was restored by two architects from Boulder, they discovered that the original cast iron columns were here, and so they recessed the front windows and highlighted those cast iron columns, and it really makes it really nice. The Arthur House, James Arthur was another important business person in town, and he was on the city council at one time. I think he was even the mayor for a short period of time. This was the house he built for his family, which consisted of he and his wife, in 1882. Again, a 2.5-story house on the corner of, well, just down here from the library, on the corner of Peterson and
Across from the fire station.
Yeah, East Mulberry, yeah, across from Fire Station Number 1, with the carriage house out in back, which is still used as offices. Okay, here's an early picture of the house. Beautiful, really stately. For many years, it was a nursing home, painted white. They had put these ugly shutters on it, and then a local realtor bought it, and he had the building sandblasted, unfortunately, which removed the finish from the brick, and then he put those shutters back. So, and I think they're gone now. I can't remember. Also in 1886, they had the laying of the cornerstone for another school building. The town was growing enough that on the other side of the tracks, so to speak, they were going to build a new K-8 school building. And that eventually, in 1889, they put in a high school program, a 4-year high school program. And this is a sketch of the building, early sketch of the building. I love these pen and ink sketches there. We should do note cards or postcards or something. See, it actually looks like the drawing. And they had one of those tube fire escapes, you know, that you slid down. And this would be right where the old Steele's Market was, right across west of the courthouse, across the street from St. Joseph's Catholic Church. And this is where the Avery children went to school. So all they had to do was walk across the street to the schoolhouse. And here's their science room, and then here's the kids. And look at the size of that class. And once they had the high school program starting in 1889, then this was one of the early graduating classes. And notice in those days they were predominantly girls, you know, because the boys were expected to quit and work. Okay, so this is the Hoffman family. This is down on the corner of Oak and Wedby, right across from the old German church. And that's the John Hoffman family with Mrs. Hoffman, and then over on the right is her grandfather or her father, John Coy, and the little girl standing next to him over there on the right was Lydia Hoffman, and she married a Morrison, and she lived in the house until about 10 years ago. She died, she was 102, and my wife and I used to take her out to lunch, and she could eat more than I could, and she had a little fluffy little rag dog. She called him Killer. Out in front of the building, same day, probably same photographer. And then the house is really very little changed today. And there's a covenant, right, Carol? If it's sold, they have to preserve the exterior. And I think this is one of the most magnificent houses in Fort Collins. This is the home that Judge Boughton, Jay Boughton, who was the original city attorney, this is what he built for his family in 1895 in the 100 block of North Sherwood. In the center of that little triangle of the porch is the date 95. And it's a 2.5-story house, and upstairs it had a big enough room that they held dances up there. And it was painted, when it was originally built, it was painted like 9 different Victorian colors. Lemon yellow, cinnamon brown, magenta. So it must have been just a magnificent house. Yes, it is standing. Painted light green today. Interesting was, Jay Boughton did all these wonderful things. That's his simple tombstone out at Grandview. That was the important thing to the family, is that he was the father. And then this is the Montezuma Fuller house. He was our first important architect. And this is the house that he built for himself and his family in 1890. And this is Montezuma Fuller, known as Monty, up in, we think possibly an office up in the Avery block. But he designed and built. He was also a builder. In those days, architects and builders were kind of interchangeable in names. Many, many churches, schools, commercial buildings, homes, not just in Fort Collins, but actually in several other towns. But this is the house as it looked. It was empty. The lady who owned it lived in Nebraska. She was on Social Security. She couldn't rent it because that would have taken away part of her Social Security. You know, it's part of our laws. So it sat empty, and then she died, and Gary Hickson was able to buy it. And then here's a close-up of what the house looked like before restoration. Gary Hickson went in and had somebody test to see what color the paint was originally, and then that's what he decided he would repaint the house. And this is the way the house was restored. And it just is a magnificent job. He thinks the original paint was probably black, but it had lead in it, and so it had oxidized, and it had turned green, and that's what the color people remembered. So that's why he painted the trim on it, the green colors. And then Fort Collins at the turn of the century, town of just over 2,000 people. This was from a sketch that a man named Houghton came in. He did it block by block, and the original of this was hanging in the old Home Federal Savings Building, and the buildings at the top, just slightly to the left of center, that's the college campus. So the main street kind of through the center, almost diagonally there, that's College Avenue. The street that goes off at an angle there toward the top right, that's Canyon. So just to give you an orientation. Okay, downtown Fort Collins, turn of the century, about 1905, Linden. Looking from Mountain, this is where the Old Town Square is today. And look at those nice long shadows. Does that tell you that it might be the middle of the winter? The low angle sun. So this is probably in December. Those people they're dressed up pretty warmly. I think there's, somewhere in there, there's one automobile. And then this was a postcard that they made from that original photograph. And the thing I think is interesting about it is, see, they put in a kind of a modern streetcar, and they also put in an automobile, but what did they forget? No, they forgot the tracks, but for the automobile, there's no shadow, no long shadow. But this is from a hand-colored postcard that was mailed in 1909 from Fort Collins. And then the commercial hotel, originally the agricultural hotel, originally stood at the corner of Mason and Mountain, and then it was moved in the early 1880s over to the Flatiron corner at Walnut and College, and then they changed the name to the Commercial, and then they tore down part of it and built in brick and stone, and this was one of their business advertising cards that they gave out. And it was a beautiful, beautiful Victorian building. You know, lots of neat features to it. The original building is this part right here with a porch here or balcony. And then they added this wing in the about 1890, the Walnut Street wing. And then came the dawn of the 20th century, as I was mentioning earlier. And the idea was, let's modernize it. Let's take off all those nice Victorian features and make it a modern-looking building, the new 20th century. So that was something that kind of hurt historic preservation. Still is three-story building. This was just after this was about 1905 when they changed it, and they changed the name to the Northern. And then this was the lobby in those days. Nice tile floor and beautiful stairway going up. And I wish they'd put back in the lobby of the Northern just a few old pieces of furniture instead of those metal chairs and tables that they have, those patio picnic table kind of things, those round. It really would make it feel a little bit more like the original. And then here's what it looked like when it was still being operated as the Northern Hotel. By then, though, it was like monthly and weekly rentals, and really, really running down. The roof was leaking. When they redid the hotel in 1905, they put in a glass dome in the dining room. Several years later, when they decided that they wanted to get rid of that because it was a perfect acoustical dome. So if the guy over there on the left, who happens to be Ansel Watrous, they were having a business conversation, the people on the other side of the dome could hear them clearly. So if you brought your girlfriend down there, you didn't want to have an intimate conversation. And then that's Senator Drake kind of in the center there with the big walrus mustache. And then way over at the right, the bald-headed guy, Frank Stover. He shows up in more pictures. my buddy. I want to do just a slideshow with pictures of Frank Stover. In 1924, they added a fourth story, and we've had a whole series of signs. And then in the mid-1930s, they did this Art Deco treatment and painted it and put in those tiles, those terracotta tiles and so on. And this is what it's been restored to today, and it's senior housing today. They've expanded the rooms, and you can have either a one-bedroom or a two-bedroom, relatively small apartments. Okay, also at the turn of the century, we had the sugar beet industry started, and they brought in trainloads of people who had immigrated to Nebraska and the Dakotas in the late 1800s. They were German-speaking people from Russia who had moved to Russia in the 1770s at the invite of Catherine the Great, a German princess. And then they were being discriminated against, so they came to the United States, to the steppes, which are the plains, and they knew how to raise sugar beets, so they were brought down here as we began growing the sugar beets in this area. And so these were the first people who came in to work the fields. And the whole families worked out in the fields. And sugar beets are very, very labor intensive and very water intensive. They produce, crops that bring in a good deal of money. And here they are harvesting the beets. They'd pull them out of the ground with a puller that actually was invented in this area. Then these people had to come through by hand and top the beets. And then those beet tops were left in the field, and they'd put the livestock in, the sheep or the cattle, to feed on the beet tops. And the sheep industry was very important here. Besides wool, they also had the feeding of lambs. And in the first decade of the 20th century, they were feeding between 300,000 and 500,000 lambs per season. Here's one that shows you this industry. In those days, black smoke pouring out of a chimney of a factory was progress. It wasn't pollution. And those are the sugar beets down in the lower left-hand corner. And once the beets were processed through the plant, that upper left-hand picture, that's the beet pulp that comes out the other end. And then the farmers could come back with their wagons, haul that out, and that was feed for the cattle and the sheep. So it was a wonderful industry, the crop that they planted to replace some of the nutrients in the soil when the crop rotation was alfalfa. Another good feed. Now see, doesn't that look like progress? That's the Great Western Sugar. This was built in 1903, went into operation in 1904, down on Vine Drive. And this was one of the few places in the state where the workers could ride the streetcar to work. The streetcar went right down past the sugar factory on its way out to Lindenmeyer Lake. But look at all those piles of sugar beets. Just piles and piles. And that's once that quit operating, and that's kind of what we've lost as part of our history. There is an operating plant over at Fort Morgan still, and the sugar beets have kind of made a comeback. But when they dropped the tariff on foreign sugar in, around late 50s, that and the Hunt brothers getting a hold of Great Western Sugar and using the money from it to speculate, trying to drive the price of silver up, they bankrupted the company. And so that kind of killed the industry around here. Today it's just called, it's the Great Sugar Company or something, and it's a farmer-owned cooperative that runs the plant over in Fort Morgan and pays the farmers to raise the beets. And there's where the streetcar track ran right by the factory. And that's all been torn down. They saved one of the low buildings, and that today is the City Streets Department. And this is just inside a part of that. And it's a nice use for it, and they have all, lining the halls, there's probably close to 100 pictures of the sugar beet industry. And then the original Fort Collins High School, with the middle building being the one built in 1903, and then they added on in 1915 on the left there, because again, the town was growing rapidly in those first couple decades. In 1904, on the other side of Sheldon Lake, not yet City Park, still a farmer's field around it, they built a racetrack, the Gentlemen's Riding and Driving Club. And just so you don't think that they were completely sexist, there was a ladies' riding and driving club on the campus. But they had stables over to the right, and then they had the big viewing stand, and this is the kind of racing they did. It was the harness racing. Remember the movie, or The Music Man? And the Music Man in one of the songs said, "You won't see a jockey sitting on the back of old Dan Patch." Dan Patch was a trotting horse. And so that's what they're talking about. And this is what they ran on the track. It was called Prospect Park, and you're looking toward that little house over there was on Mountain Avenue, the west end of Mountain Avenue. 1904, and it operated until, I think, the start of the Depression is what killed it. But they used to have shows and everything out there. And then 1905, they decided they need a bigger water treatment facility, so up the Poudre Canyon, they built the water treatment plant up there. And this is where Gateway Park is today, owned by the city. And they preserved the buildings, and I don't know if they're going to do anything with the building eventually. They're talking about some kind of a water museum, the same as we're talking about at the old waterworks out on Overland Trail. And here's that Elks building. Lots of postcards showing the Elks building. And that was built that same era, that first decade of the 20th century. And nice hand-colored postcards, hand-tinted. And then there's that explosion. There's the back of the Elks building, or the old YMCA that was blown off. They do not know, they never found out. The guy that owned the flower shop had been in the military and was an explosives expert. And they think he may have done something that they couldn't trace. Yeah. But no, they never did. They said it was definitely not a gas leak. It was definitely not dynamite or anything. So, and then there's that ugly thing that they replaced it with. Also in that first decade of the 20th century, they had the lamb feeding was so important that they would have these lamb days. And thousands of people would come to Fort Collins, and they'd have a big parade. They would set up some pits around the old courthouse, and they would cook the lamb and give it away free to promote the idea that we were called the lamb feeding capital of the world, not of Colorado or the U.S., of the world. So the lamb feeding thing was very, very important. And then they purchased the land for City Park starting in 1907. And this was the boating and swimming area with the pier that was built out with the diving boards on the end of it. Probably a little cleaner lake in those days. Okay. And then Mr. Avery's beautiful First National Bank, he moved across Mountain Avenue in 1908 into this beautiful new building. And then, of course, the college was growing. This was still the Agricultural College of Colorado, and a very important part of the community, as it continues to be. And the building on the left in that picture with the tower is the original building, Old Main. And then the one right, kind of just to the right of center, is Spruce Hall, which has been added on to very sympathetically. It's where continuing education has its offices. And then Jesse Harris, who was a local horse raiser, he donated a fountain, and he brought water in from the foothills, and it came up in that little thing that you see over there on the left. And that's called the Harris Fountain. The paper said it was tinctured, slightly tinctured with iodine. That was the taste. So it was spring water, but it had that slight taste to it. No, it's still over there on the campus. Okay. Just doesn't work anymore. Yeah, it's over just south of Spruce Hall, along with the monument for the donors. Okay, and then the Oval, in what that car would be about 1920 probably. You know, the tree is much smaller in those days. And then in 1907 they decided that, hey, let's have public transportation, and this is the first cut for laying the tracks for the streetcar down. Just behind that big tractor is St. Joseph's Church. So this is just west of Howe Street. Okay, and here's one of the bigger interurban cars they ran from 1907 to 1918, and then they went out of business, and the city purchased it and brought in the little Bernie cars. Here they are meeting down at College Avenue. They even had little trailer cars, not little trailer cars. I mean full-size cars with no motors that they could hook on behind and pull with these big interurban cars. And then they extended the line out to Lindenmeyer Lake because they built a big recreation area out there, a big park, and they had rowboats and canoes, and then this 23-foot long power boat. And off to one edge there was a place where you could take your girlfriend, and there was a tree called the spooning tree. Some of you, if you're old enough to know what spooning means. Not that many, obviously. Okay, H.C. Bradley, who took the first picture of the streetcar, he was a photographer in town, but now we're into the automotive era, so he quit being a photographer, sold his business to C.C. Patrick, and he started selling Cadillacs and Overland automobiles. But before he did that, this was a picture that he took the end of February 1908, and he caught in the background, actually he's standing on the back of the southbound trolley. I don't think they'd turned off the power, so he had to watch out for the overhead wire, but he caught the trolley less than 2 months after it started running in the background. And this picture is about twice this wide, and it was all of the cars in Fort Collins at that time. And we reproduced that photograph several years ago with the Antique Car Club. And we actually put the guy, there's another copy of this that has the names on it, and the man right here in this car was Alan Greenacre. When we redid the photograph, we put his nephew, Jim Greenacre, right in the same spot. In 1911, Union Pacific came in, 1910, 1911, bought up all of the north side of Jefferson Street and had a raffle, sold off the houses, and built the Union Pacific Depot. And that's right at the end of Pine Street on Jefferson. This was also a big fruit growing area, apples, cherries, lots of cherry orchards around here in the early parts of the 20th century. Look at all those apples. And what do you do with apples? Turn them into applejack. I'm sorry, apple cider. If you let it sit long enough, you have applejack. But this is a cider press. This was out on the Cunningham farm out at the corner of Shields and Horsetooth. In the winter of 1913 and 1914, we had a couple of really big snowstorms, and this is College Avenue. Stopped the trolleys right in the middle of the street. They had to keep them running, you know, for a couple days. And notice how they cleared the street. Can you look at those and see? Shovelful by shovelful. And there it's over on the right. It says, picking ice off the rails is slow work to get the trolleys running again. And there they are, clearing off the trolley tracks in January of 1914. One shovelful at a time. I don't know if the trolley was trying to keep up, that guy was going so fast or what. And this is my favorite picture of that snowstorm. The streetcar, the building on the kind of to the right of center at the top is the Northern Hotel, so this looking north in the 100 block of College. The streetcars right straight down the middle are behind the kid, stalled. But what's he thinking? My thought is he's saying, sure, take my picture, but as soon as you're done, I'm going to hit that camera with that snowball. And she's saying, oh, don't do that, Harold. In the later 19 teens, they started paving the street, and they paved first the 100 block of South College, and then they blocked it off and had a dance. Also in the teens, they started building the road up the Poudre Canyon from up where Mishawaka is through the Big and Little Narrows. And this is just after they built the tunnel through the Baldwin Tunnel up there in the Little Narrows. And that's lady who became Mrs. Peasley. Paul Peasley took pictures starting when he was in high school until he was in his late 80s. 1914, we celebrated the semi-centennial, in other words, the half-centennial of the town, with a big parade, and they brought in Indians, and they had floats and so on. It's coming off of Linden onto Jefferson Street by Stover's City Drugstore. The town was dry, starting in 1896 for almost 75 years, and Frank Stover was always getting ticketed for selling alcohol. Most of the patent medicines were about 50 or 60 proof. So you really didn't need to buy liquor. You just go buy a medicine and drink it. Lydia Pinkham Vegetable Compound kept the ladies very happy at home. And then this is College Avenue in the 20s. Beautiful tree-lined street with the streetcar tracks running down the middle. This is over by College and Elizabeth. And that's the end.